This is James Taylor, and you're listening to The Creative Life. The Creative Life podcast is a show created for you, the creative. If you're looking for inspiration, motivation, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's a musician, writer, artist, designer, performer, educator, or creative entrepreneur. They share their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, their insights, and much, much more. In this episode, I talk with Mike Brown of Brainzooming about being more strategic, going from ideas to implementation, and how tables help or hinder creativity. Enjoy this episode. Hey, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Mike Brown. Mike Brown is founder of the Brainzooming Group. He has been at the forefront of leading Fortune 500 culture change, developing simplified tools for innovation, strategy planning, and branding to maximize collaboration and business results. Mike is known for providing non-experts with dynamic tools so they can succeed like experts. Finally, his Brainzooming blog turns 10 years old later in 2017 and is visited annually by readers in 190 countries. And it's my great pleasure to have Mike with us today. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you very much, James. It's great to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
So share with our listeners what's going on in your world just now.
This day specifically is nuts. I got up at 3:30 and started working on projects and snuck into church and breakfast. And I've got going to be focused on content marketing for a nonprofit this afternoon, and then hit the road tonight to go to a new client where we're doing strategic planning for a shared services group inside of a sort of a quasi-governmental organization. So it's a little bit of one of everything today, at least.
Where did it all begin for you? How did you get into this world of innovation and strategy?
Strategy actually was from the corporate world. So I had been at a small research company for a couple of years after getting out of business school here in Kansas City. It wasn't going well. I sort of considered it a second MBA. It was a lot of learning, and got a job at a company called Yellow Freight, which ultimately became Yellow Transportation and YRC Worldwide. We had a variety of names. It was right around the corner that did transportation. And I didn't really want to go to work for a trucking company, but coming home and saying what the offer was to my wife relative to the startup, she was like, no, you will be taking that job. So being the dutiful husband, I took the job, and I was there for 18 years. And along the way, transportation wasn't necessarily that innovative. There are certainly parts of it that were more innovative. But in the early 90s, I met a guy named Chuck Dimer who was out of Kansas City, and I was hosting an American Marketing Association luncheon. I was on the board locally, and Chuck talked about creativity. And I was just, it's like, this is really cool. And we hit it off, and over time we worked with Chuck. We had him come in and help us do some strategy things, and eventually somebody accused me of just having morphed my job into Chuck's job, even though I was inside this company. I said, well, yeah, I probably did. And so having really an opportunity over a number of years, we tripled in size during one 30-month period. We went from 3 billion to 10 billion. We'd acquired a bunch of other companies, and I got deployed to go help them. And because we were all competitive companies, they were all in transportation and up against each other in the marketplace, I was told you can help them, but you can't tell them what to do because they all have their separate P&Ls and they have to take responsibility for that. So I thought, well, that's a little bit of a challenge. But I figured out if I could start to ask them questions, and if they were down the right path, cheer them on, and if they were the wrong, down a path that wasn't as good or wasn't as strategic, throw in a creativity exercise and say, well, hey, can we look at it like this? And it wasn't the confrontational relationship that was existing in other parts of the company as we'd acquired these companies, and provided an opportunity over, 3, 4, 5 years to do hundreds of these sessions. And quite honestly, James, that became Brainzooming. I had started blogging about it a couple of years before I left the corporate world, and here's what we were doing. Took names out of it, took companies out of it, but just the experience. Started tweeting about it, and that really provided the entree to say, you know what, I'm going to roll this out and do it for other companies. And that was 8 years ago, later this year.
And before you kind of started building your own frameworks. Who were some of the mentors or the people that you look to, or the people with the ideas in terms of those facilitating those meetings, those innovation meetings, or those creativity meetings?
It's funny. I mean, I really pulled from a variety of sources. So Chuck was an early influence. I had a boss at Yellow or YRC named Greg Reed, who came in from the consumer packaged goods world. And it was just, he and I just paired up so well. He was the big visionary, had these incredible ideas, and I was the person that could figure out how to do them, but then articulate them back into the organization. So working with Greg, who saw talents in me that I didn't see in myself and really opened up doors to emceeing programs and being able to do conference production, things that I'd done in the past. So those are a couple of in-person ones, but what went into Brainzooming, I mean, we'd work with big-time consultants, and I'd been grabbing exercises over time, but the challenge with those was they typically threw 4 or 5 really high-powered young MBAs at us, and it was great when they were there because they worked 18 hours a day, and they did work for corporate people who didn't understand it or didn't want to do it. But then when they were gone, there wasn't a lot of institutional knowledge. So I started down that path of how do I create questions and structure so that people who aren't Northwestern MBAs can do this stuff on their own. And that was sort of an influence. And one year, it was to bring Greg back into it, planning would look a little different every year as I was picking up new techniques. And one spring, I guess, I came in, he said, what's planning going to look like this year? And I said, well, have you ever seen the show Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, which used to be, I don't know, on Bravo or something, but it was, they take some guy who didn't get life basically and surround him with these 5 experts. I said, that's what planning is going to be. Because I said, we have a lot of people who aren't experts, but they need to be, and we'll surround them with a few people and structure and let them go to town. So there's reality TV stuff in there. There's improv comedy. I basically grab from wherever I can to go, oh, that's a way to help people think about something, or that's a connection that maybe people are struggling with, but this idea will help them make. So it's a grab bag of stuff.
What do you remember what that first framework was that you kind of created that was your own, and what kind of client were you using it with, and what kind of results did you get from that?
Gosh, it's all, this sounds probably horrible to say. Over time, particularly as I've been doing more and more writing, I read less and less of other people, so their ideas don't sort of morph into mine. But one that we did that was just sort of really, I know, came from just trying to put something together is we were doing a plan for a state forestry organization in the United States. And the head of it had just read the book Black Swans about, the internet or 9/11 or these events that just come out of nowhere and just upend things. And he said, a neighboring state a year or two earlier had done what they thought was going to be a controlled burn to sort of clear off some land. And it got out of hand, and some homes were burned down, some people died. And he said they defunded the state forestry group, just like that, the state legislature did. And he said, that's a black swan. How do we plan for that? So I stepped back, and the whole premise of black swans is you can't predict them. You don't know where they're going to come from. So I realized, well, maybe if we couldn't predict what those things were, we could do an exercise that helped them think about what are the parts of the organization they almost don't even think about anymore. They just run so well, or they're just sort of out of sight, out of mind. And I thought a really good comparison to that was a scene from Ghostbusters, where if you've seen that movie before, listeners have seen that movie, the Ghostbusters are up on top of this apartment building, and one of the ghosts or ghouls or goblins tells them that whatever crosses their mind first is will be what kills them. And one of them, I think it's Ray, thinks of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man because nothing could be more harmless and just was so kind as a child. And then here's a 150-pound Stay Puft Marshmallow Man that tries to fry them. And so the whole exercise really was like, that's it. It's the safe things that are going to kill you when those go south. So Ghostbusters and the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man became the inspiration for how we wrapped this thing up and gave them a way to look at the processes that really did work well, or they weren't thinking about, or boy, if that something happened there, we didn't have a backup, and that became this black swan exercise. So that was pretty much wholly created from, I guess, still watching Ghostbusters, but it was a good point of inspiration at least.
And it doesn't. I seem to remember it doesn't end well for the big dough guy.
No,
it doesn't end well. One of the things, I mean, I love reading the blog, and I follow a lot through your Twitter account, and I kind of go in and see different posts there as well. I was reading one the other day that you wrote about how tables can help or hinder creativity. And I thought it was really interesting because I was in a room last week, and I was actually thinking about that as that same thing. So give people maybe a bit of an insight if they haven't read the Brainzooming blog and they haven't kind of followed you before as well. To tell us about that particular post.
Boy, and I wish I could remember why that came up. Probably because I was moving tables around in some room. But it's the idea that tables and the physical configuration of a room can have so much impact on how people collaborate. And the event planning side of my background really comes in what we do, that we are creating events, even if it's a couple of people. And, where people sit around a conference table makes a big difference. There's those power positions at the end or sort of right to the side of the end. And I always tell people that if you're going to disagree with someone or you think you're going to have a contentious conversation with them, sit next to them, because it's really tough to disagree with somebody you're sitting next to. I mean, you physically have to change your position to do it. But if I have somebody that I'm working with that I know we're going to agree, I'll try and position us across the table from each other, because I said, I want you over there because I know we're going to be in the same spot. And we love tables that we can move around and create space. I've been in a lot of rooms where the table, they basically built 2 feet around a table, and that was the room. And there's just no room to work. And when you're in there, people can't get up, they can't move around, and that can constrain ideas. So, yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about the physical space, and that was one just sort of noodling about, well, how does a table fit, and what can you do with a table, even if it's not a great table, to try and create more collaboration.
It was funny because after you wrote that post, I was talking to a colleague, and he'd just been working with IKEA, the Swedish company, and he said he always tries to get into in this case it was a conference, like a 2-day conference they were doing. He was going in there working on the creativity innovation side, and he said, I always like getting in there at least 3 hours beforehand, just sitting in the back of the room, sitting in the room and getting a sense of the people in the room. And he said it's interesting because you can so often find who are the unspoken power players in the room, who are the decision makers, who are the people that you can probably have a bit of a laugh with, and who are the people they're going to be the ones that you probably don't want to call out on anything, because they're going to have the stats and statistics around stuff as well.
Exactly. And a couple of years ago, we were doing a community collaboration event in Carbondale, Illinois. They were looking at trying to bring broadband in, and we were doing something at Southern Illinois University, which is my alma mater, and then the city of Carbondale the next day. But when we first got there, we were having a luncheon with school administrators, and I wasn't on the hook to do anything. I was just, enjoying lunch and basking in my alma mater. And one of the guys that we work with, who hopefully he's not going to listen to this, I better be careful with this, but he got up and he just started asking these administrators these big questions about, well, where do you think a university should go? And what do you think the challenges are? And why don't things happen? And nobody said a word. They wouldn't answer the questions. And then finally one person in the bottom of the U spoke. Well, it turns out it wasn't the chancellor, but it was the ombudsman or somebody. And then they would talk a little bit afterwards. So as we broke for lunch, my colleague comes over and says, well, we want you to do an exercise. I said, what do you mean? We need to do an exercise to get feedback. I said, well, this isn't how we work. We plan this stuff out. So I then started tearing around the student union at SIU, trying to bribe people into letting me use a copy machine. And I came back, and instead of asking them questions where they had to answer in front of everybody, I gave them a sheet of paper with 2 or 3 questions that we were going to use that evening and the next day. And all of a sudden, we got participation because people didn't have to say it in front of somebody else. So that's a table, but that's a setting situation. And who's in the room, just as you were talking about the person that you had spoken with, seeing 15 minutes of they're never going to participate told me, don't stand up and try and throw a creativity exercise at them and discuss it. Go find something that lets them write or have some privacy, because then they'll participate.
And I've seen things like brain writing techniques work really well where you're in maybe in an organization where there's a bit strong power or there's strong silos going on in the organization. You have to bring people together, or there's some internal politics that's going on as well. And by just doing that process of brainwriting, having everyone write something, and then maybe things get passed around the room and get added to, or new thoughts are added to them as well. It's interesting because it also stops that thing that can sometimes I've seen happen in ideation sessions or brainstorming, where you have the domination of the person with the whiteboard pen. That person that just dominates. It's usually it's a guy, unfortunately, and it really is pretty crushing for people's creativity when that happens.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because that's one of the things I tell people, and even senior groups when I do things on strategic thinking, and a lot of people will say, and almost purposefully say, well, I'm not strategic, I'm just a doer. And I think they do that to basically get out of having to think about what they do so that they can just go act. But I always tell people, I said, one of the biggest things you can do to be seen and actually be more strategic is to get to the whiteboard and start to capture the conversation and be able to play it back to the group, not in chronological order, which is how so many meeting notes, we said this at 9:15 and we said this at 9:37 and we wrapped up at 9:55. But that isn't how information forms. It's not how decisions get made. But that person who gets up there and starts to capture, you're basically becoming the journalist for the meeting. And as you play it back, you can start to form what's typically a chronological depiction into, well, here are decisions or here are themes that emerge, and really start to shape it. But you're absolutely right. You can use that power for good or bad. And yeah, people get up and basically use whiteboards, and at times they use too much knowledge as a way to shut other people down.
And I guess that's the benefit of bringing an organization like yours, because you're in that facilitation role. You kind of help with some of those things, and you provide a structure for them as well, and a kind of a safer space from which to explore their ideas.
A space, and also because we're not bound by the internal politics and the reporting structures, we can play around with things and try and mitigate people who are doing stuff like that. Although it was interesting because doing that inside a company, I was doing it with, people who were a level or two above me in the company or peers. I had one peer that he was a really nice guy, and he gave us a lot of room to try out stuff. And I always said his kids were like, grandkids. I got to go play with them, but I didn't have to have them report to me or give them performance reports. But I had a session, and I knew he would suck the creative air out of the meeting. So what I did was I put one of the people who worked for me with him, and he never got to move, and everybody else got to move during the course of the day. They would rotate around his table. So I knew the person who worked for me could help control him in that small group when I couldn't be right there, but I could also keep everybody fresh by not having anybody else stuck with him all day. So yeah, it's a lot easier. And in that case, I guess I was sort of an outsider inside the company because they looked at me as a neutral party. But managing those dynamics and managing them on the fly is a really important part of making sure people aren't sucking creativity because they don't want new ideas, or they're so eager to share new ideas, they take up all the space for other people to contribute.
And in your journey that you've had and the work that you do, can you tell us about a time where you worked on a project, you worked on something, you gave it your heart and your soul, but for whatever reason, it just didn't work out like you'd hoped? And more importantly, what were the lessons that you took from that experience?
One example, and I probably didn't give it my heart and soul at the end, which was the problem. We had done a really big In fact, up until about a year ago, the longest creative session we'd ever done was for a racing program, a NASCAR racing program we had. It was 2.5 days, and it was fun. I mean, because we were just imagining what could we do with racing. And one of the ideas was that when it was at the Sprint Cup at the time, and Sprint was located here in Kansas City where I'm at, but when the Sprint Cup race came to Kansas City, we should have an entire week of yellow racing. And that was, our company was Yellow. So we'd have all these events, and we'd have an event on the Country Club Plaza, which is the ritzy outdoor shopping area that goes back to the 20s or 30s in Kansas City. And so, great idea. We'll do this when it comes up. Well, the marketing communications group picked up on this, and they were starting to build toward it. And they didn't report to me at the time. They later did. They didn't at this time. And they started telling me about this. Is like, we want you to come MC the event and create excitement, and we're going to have a country star, and we're going to have our driver, and we're going to block off parts of the road, and we'll have this big thing. And I should have known. I asked them one of my narky event planning questions, like, how many porta potties are you going to have? And they said, we don't have any idea. I said, well, how many people do you think you're going to have? And they couldn't answer these questions. And I should have intervened, but it's like, this isn't my deal. It's not my event, but those are some pretty basic questions. So ultimately, I emceed it, and I think we had about 30 people show up. It was a disaster. And the country performer, they had just a rinky-dink little speaker, and he blew out the speaker like on one chord of rehearsal. And so we had no amplifier. They were chasing around to a Best Buy or something to find a system. And the guy that I work with took the musician over to a barbecue place and bought him a few drinks to make up for it. And there was the person who had been like the main event planner. I don't know. This became corporate rumor that I said a few things to her and that she went into a catatonic trance and disappeared for a couple of days. But I mean, ultimately, this country performer gets up with an acoustic guitar and plays a set with no amplification, but this crowd is small enough everybody could get around. So that was a great example of a really good idea that had a lot of promise, but we just started rolling with it and didn't really put the checks in place or come back and evaluate it to say, well, there's a lot of promise here, but do we really have the mechanics and the infrastructure in place to make it happen? And I suppose the punishment I had for it was I was the guy who had to get up and try and yell and get the crowd's attention with no PA system. So I became the face of the event, even though it wasn't my event. So lesson learned there.
So if you do that again, just kind of bringing in the events people at an earlier stage, or just very much impressing upon them the process.
But I think the bigger lesson, if somebody's listening, is, well, I don't do events. I think it's that idea that an idea can seem really incredible when you come up with it, and it can gain some momentum in a meeting or a workshop. And even if you think, wow, we're vetting it and we're refining it, it benefits from some distance to step away and say, okay, it's a great idea. Now, how are we going to execute that idea? Do we have the wherewithal? Do we have the dollars? Do we have the expertise? Do we have the people? Do we have the infrastructure to execute it? And I think in that case, the idea of a whole week was great, but some of the elements of it, like take this to a part of town that really doesn't understand NASCAR and probably isn't going to come out on a Thursday night to come see race car drivers, I think we'd have probably killed that piece of it. So I think, again, that's applicable to any big idea, is give it some time and step away, and don't let that first blush of this is our best idea ever carry you into something that really is not going to make sense.
And what about in this journey you've had, in this creative journey you've had, any insights or light bulb moment where you've gone, okay, this is the direction I want to be going with what we're doing at Brainzooming, or this is a key insight that you had in the work that you do?
Probably, and there have obviously been a variety of them, and they hopefully happen very frequently, but we talked about sort of starting to try and bring creativity into the strategic planning I was doing. And I had a strategy background and market research background. And so when we did this initially inside the company, we basically did creative sessions, and we'd leave brand managers with 600 or 1,000 ideas in a spreadsheet. It's like, hey, we documented these, look at all these ideas, and move on to the next person. And it started to become apparent that they didn't know what to do with that. They had no way to narrow those ideas, to put them together, and they would just basically put them to the side and go back and do what they were doing. And it was when we had a senior VP in the company said he had a president of one of their subsidiaries was on the hook and had to have a plan within about 2 weeks, or he was going to be on some thin ice. And I found an article I think it was in an Inc. magazine, about a guy who was doing business plans in 2 days. And I grabbed one of the guys that I worked with and I said, you know what? We've got all the stuff in place. We could do this. And it was when we started to make that shift from, it's less about 1,000 ideas and more about opening up people's thinking in a strategic way, and then putting the implementation planning on top of it, that they can actually go do something. And that's where I think what became Brainzooming really started, with that shift of, it's not about just fun and games and big ideas. It's about how do you find the right balance of open thinking, but lock it into, we've got to go sell something. We've got to go do something with it. It's not just okay to have a bunch of ideas. And that really did. That's when we made the shift. We started doing a lot more of these, and I think we made more progress with it because people saw that there were tangible deliverables coming out of these things that their people benefited from and their customers were benefiting from. So
I've seen organizations do very well in that, the first piece, let's say the idea generation, being very good at that. And I've seen other ones that are good at idea generation and refining that down into which of these ideas are worth pursuing. But right. the third one of then taking of these ideas or this idea that we're going to pursue, putting a plan around it, that's a much rarer thing. I think many companies will deal at the front end, they'll deal at the nice, enjoyable kind of workshop end, but they won't want to kind of deal a little bit further down. So any tips for maybe people listening just now, maybe they're working inside organizations, or maybe they're just a 2-person business and they have all these ideas, and maybe they kind of have a sense of which ones they want to pursue, but how do you translate that into a plan?
Yeah, interestingly enough, it came down to a couple of 3 questions, and we found out that if we asked these questions, even if people weren't precisely answering those questions, it was starting to narrow things in where their answers we could take and turn into a plan. And that was a huge key for us, is people didn't know how to fill out planning templates. And that's what the consultants did. They handed them a template and said, go fill this out. Well, they didn't know how to fill it out. We took all of the templates out of it, said, you know what, we know how to write a plan. So we would do these sessions during the day, and then we'd sit in the conference room or the ballroom we did it in at night and type up their plan, and they had it the next day. So I think, my tip to people is always, spend the time, imagine the ideas, do it every day. Don't just have a specific time where you do it. But as you look at making an impact into the marketplace, think about what matters for our brand. We always try and tie everything back to, again, it can be a great idea, but if it's not moving your brand ahead, it's not a great idea. It needs to be able to create some impact. Think about, what are you trying to achieve? And that's one of our core questions, because as people answer that, you get a sense of objectives, you get pieces of strategy, and you'll even start to get some tactics. And then you can theme those up, narrow those down, and then from those answers say, well, how are we going to go accomplish it? And that's when people start to get into tactics. And we use those 3 questions to facilitate people through. We got it down when we were doing transportation session after transportation session every day, which had its own set of challenges. When you have the same people in the room every day and they've heard all your jokes and seen all your funny slides, it becomes, I spent more time looking for funny pictures, but when we were doing it all the time in the same industry and people were getting practiced at it, we could get the guts of a plan done in about 35 or 40 minutes with those questions. And that, for me, is the zooming part of brain zooming, is the speed with which we get through it. And I tell people, and you note, what we do looks a little bit different because it grew up on the client side. I had strategy and I also had implementation. So if stuff wasn't working, the people, I wasn't gone after the fun workshop. I was there and people were in my door complaining about why isn't this working or why isn't this getting done. So what we do reflects that sense of somebody needs a plan or somebody needs to know what they're going to go do to make this happen. And I think also a real respect for the voices and the knowledge that exists inside a business. Because I spent a lot of time with consultants that would come through and I do the brain dump every time and here's all the research reports, and then they'd sort of come back and play that back. And I use that consciously because I knew if they expressed the same point of view I'd been trying to express, it was going to have a different type of credibility. And if that got us progress, that was fantastic. But because of living inside a company for 18 years, I have a real respect for a lot of people know the right things to do. We're rarely going to come in and give them 100%. Well, here's our expert opinion from the outside. What we do is create the opportunities for those people inside who maybe never get the opportunity to voice that or voice their ideas in a constructive way to do that, so that when it comes back, the plans we do, they sound like the organization.
Yeah, it's their ideas. It's that institutional knowledge that gets passed over a lot of the time when consultants come in, and they'll go for whatever the latest Harvard Business Review framework is, and they'll impress that upon the organization. At the end, you may have maybe a plan there, but it doesn't. There's a lack of fit with the organization. I'm interested. You've been talking a lot about frameworks, but let's talk about some, as we start to finish up here, some resources and tools. Are there any online resources or tools or apps like Evernote that you love and you find really useful for the work you do?
It's a real oddball. I mean, I had listened to your podcast. I was trying to think. I mean, I love Shazam. That you can, put your phone up and hear a song and it'll tell you what the song is. So that saves me a lot of time finding out new music. I mean, we're just starting to use an online collaboration platform called Meeting Sphere. We'd used one called Think Tank for a few years, and they changed their pricing model. It just wasn't making sense. But Think Tank for us was the first time that I had seen a collaboration platform where we could translate what we did in person and do it all online. I mean, we've done plans completely online that people have never come together. And it's worked tremendously well. And like I said, we're now using Meeting Sphere, which I think is close. We're still kind of learning that. But I think if you can find that type of thing, that's a huge advantage for us in our business. Another one that is not necessarily creativity oriented a little bit, but has become really important for us is HubSpot, the inbound marketing system.
Great system.
We're into year 3 of it, and had just written so many blog posts, and it wasn't doing enough with ebooks over time. So in terms of growing our business, HubSpot, while it's not the cheapest, it's certainly not the most expensive option out there, but it was great for us to start to capture leads and be able to get ebooks out there and start to do a lot more with the web traffic that I'd built really since a couple of years before leaving corporate that we just didn't do a whole heck of a lot with. We didn't know our readers very well. We didn't know what their issues were. So that has been a real fundamental one for us.
Awesome. And we'll put all these links here. People go to jamestaylor.me and just look for Mike Brown, and you're going to get all these links here as well. What about a book? What would the book be if you were to recommend to one people? And as you mentioned Shazam, and I love Shazam as well, what would be the one album or record that you would suggest?
Well, I actually went and grabbed this book off the shelf because I thought we might talk that shift from corporate to how you take advantage of a corporation and still creative. It's called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. It's by Gordon McKenzie, and he was at Hallmark for many years. His title was The Creative Paradox at Hallmark. And in my first job, we did a lot of work for Hallmark. I never got to meet him, but we heard a lot about him. And then my boss, Greg Reed, had found this book, or somebody had recommended it to him. And it's really this idea that the corporation is that hairball. And sometimes you want to be close to the hairball because it has resources and it allows you to do things. And other times you want to be really far out in your orbit because it'll stop you from doing things. And anybody who's listening, who's in a corporation or trying to find that right balance, I think Gordon just had a really incredible way of thinking about that. Music-wise, I'm an REM fan of their early stuff. The sort of the some of the early
Automatic
groups,
for the People and things like that.
Yeah, even older than that, though. So probably Murmur or Life's a Rich Pageant would be my Desert Island disc from REM. But other than that, it's more kind of singles and stuff to listen to while exercising.
Awesome, and we'll put all these on the show notes as well. As we start to finish up here, let's imagine you woke up tomorrow morning and you had to start from scratch. So you've got all the tools, all the frameworks, all the knowledge that you've acquired doing the work that you do, but no one knows you. You know no one. You have no contacts. What would you do? How would you restart?
James, I would probably do many of the same things I did. I'd go out and speak because that's a great way for a lot of people to have an in-person experience with you. And if you can bring them beneficial ideas and they feel enriched by the experience, that can be a big help. I'd probably do more video than I did because I think that's the way things are moving and how people are consuming more and more content. But I would also get a website out there and I'd start creating as much content as I could. And it's interesting the outreaches I get from organizations selling social media and content marketing systems and say, well, this is for your team. I said, well, I largely write all of this myself. There's no team. And I realized coming out of a corporation, there would be a lot of people claiming they're creativity people or innovation people, but that if I wrote enough, you can't BS your way through, I think it's now 2,300 blog posts. You must know something. And I've done that really to help us compete against much larger, much more conventional type agencies. So I think that has paid dividends for us, and I benefited by doing it for so long. But if I had to start over, I'd get on it and get on it quickly.
Absolutely, and it's a great resource. I'm always kind of dipping in there just for ideas. It's wonderful because, and especially I mentioned I follow you on Twitter as well. And it's sometimes, you'll be sitting there of a Friday afternoon and you're kind of starting to think about things and something will pop up that you post. And it's kind of refreshing. It comes at it from a different angle. And I really enjoy the way that you write and the way that you think about things as well. So for people that aren't already on Brainzooming and don't already know about it, where should they go? What are the links that people should head to?
Brainzooming.com is the website, and you can click up on the top to get to the blog. And there's categorization there. So if you're looking at any specific area or searching, or if you've got a question, you can send it to me on there at info@brainzooming.com if you're trying to look for something specific. And on Twitter, we're at Brainzooming. So yeah, we share links, and it's good to hear that. I try and feature links on there that people have resonated with, they've clicked or they've saved, and there's a randomness to it that I hope it will find the right person when they need it at the right moment, and it'll make a difference for them. So, James, thank you for having me on today. This has been fantastic.
Well, Mike, it's been a pleasure having you. Thanks so much for coming on. We'll put all these on the show notes as well, and I look forward to reading the blog for many, many years to come. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Take care.
Hey, James Taylor here again. And if you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.